For over 50 years, Burlington's legacy has been great deals on coats for all weather conditions. So before you're caught unprepared for the winter weather, head to Burlington for name brands, quality items, and surprising fits for every family member. Stock up on coats, sweaters, and accessories before the cold hits, so you can finally stop avoiding the elements and start living comfortably. Warm up at your nearest Burlington location less than 1 mile away. Burlington. Deals, brands, wow.
Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. You know, one of the perks about having 4 kids that you know about is actually getting a direct line to the big man up north. And this year, he wants you to know the best gift that you can give someone is the gift of Mint Mobile's unlimited wireless for $15 a month. Now, you don't even need to wrap it. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Hi, and welcome back to Amicus. This is Slate's podcast about the courts and the law and what used to be the law and how we might continue to protect all that. I'm Dahlia Lithwick. That's my beat at Slate. This past week has been something of a walk of shame in terms of press freedoms and the future of press freedoms. The week, as you know, opened with the shocking revelation that ABC News had decided to settle a defamation lawsuit brought by Donald J. Trump, the patron saint of frivolous lawsuits, after ABC host George Stephanopoulos described the E. Jean Carroll jury as having found him liable for rape as opposed to sexual abuse. ABC's settlement was to the tune of $15 million to Trump's future presidential foundation and museum, plus $1 million in attorney's fees, and also they had to issue a public apology. ABC News decided to settle because, as their parent company Disney later explained to the New York Times, they wanted to protect the rights of a free press for all of the rest of us. Also this week, Trump filed suit against the Des Moines Register and their pollster, Ann Seltzer, accusing both of election interference over a poll that showed him losing the state of Iowa. So are we in the Tim Snyder obeying in advance universe, or in Disney's wonderful world of settling cases in order to preserve future press rights? Joining us to unpack this, I think, really frightening week is Sonja West. She is the Otis Brumby Distinguished Professor in First Amendment Law from the University of Georgia. She specializes in constitutional law, media law, and the U.S. Supreme Court. She was also a media lawyer and a reporter in her earlier life. Welcome back to the show, Sonja.
Thanks so much for having me, Dahlia.
And Margaret Sullivan, who has become one of the leading voices for the media responsibility in the second Trump era and all the ways we may have gotten it wrong in the past. She does that by way of her newsletter, American Crisis. Margaret is a columnist for The Guardian. She was the Washington Post's media columnist from 2016 to 2022. Before joining the Post, she was the New York Times public editor and previously the chief editor of the Buffalo News, her hometown paper, where she started as a summer intern. Welcome to Amicus, Margaret.
Thank you so much. Great to be here to talk about this fraught topic.
It's fraught, and I think for journalists, it's really like frisson of terror in a way that is hard to explain, I think, to people who are either disillusioned with the project of journalism or who don't fully understand the role of the press in the coming years. And that's, I think, why we're so desperate to talk to the both of you. And Margaret, I think I want to start by noting that in your Substack this week, you kind of made the case for this as just straight up bending the knee, and bending the knee with really serious, dire consequences for journalism writ large. You noted that this outcome is just going to encourage Trump to do this over and over again, to bully the press, and he needs no encouragement. And you wrote that the Buffalo News, where you used to work, traditionally refused to settle defamation cases because, quote, settling would only encourage more people to sue. So I would love for you to sort of make the case that you made in the Substack, which is this isn't just about ABC and Donald Trump. This is about how defamation is used to chill all journalism going forward.
I was very disturbed to see the way this was handled by ABC, and we can't forget for 1 second that ABC News is owned by and run by Disney. So the idea that there would be a settlement, and not only a settlement, but also with an apology, both from George Stephanopoulos and from ABC News, was really disturbing because it's kind of buckling. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a lot of experience with following these kinds of things and even being in charge of a newsroom that, did get sued from time to time. I think this case was very winnable for ABC News, and I think they should have stood strong, not only for their own well-being and their own network and reputation, but also for, sort of journalism writ large, because it really opens the door. Trump, as I said, needs no encouragement to sue the press, sue news organizations, or bully the press. But this definitely gives him a lot of encouragement. It's like, great, this is what can happen when I go after news organizations or commentators or journalists. I get a settlement. I get to talk. I'm speaking in Trump's voice here, which I don't really like to do, but the idea being I get to crow about how right I was. And in this case, was he right? That's a murky question that we can get into.
I'll just add on to there. I was a media law lawyer who defended news organizations. And just to add on to what Margaret's saying about how much this feels like we're living in the upside down versus how we used to handle things, I think is absolutely correct. I don't think there's anyone who really feels like ABC would have been this quick to hand over $15 million and an apology to any other plaintiff who wasn't Donald Trump on a case where they did have, while not an airtight defense, a very strong defense, certainly one that they had a lot of ability to continue fighting. So it feels like, to most people anyway, that they settled this case precisely because this was Donald Trump, which is the exact opposite of how it's supposed to be. The fact that they were being sued by both a former president and an incoming president should make them feel even more protected by the First Amendment. It should make them feel even more determined to fight this fight. And yet, for some reason, it seemed like it was the other way around. And on the same sort of line about how up is down and down is up, we are seeing, and just the political reality is that smaller, local, regional news outlets, they do have to start settling some of these cases. We aren't in the 60s and 70s of the heyday where even a regional news outlet could have fought a case all the way to the Supreme Court. But that's not who this was. This is Disney. They had the finances. They could have fought this. And for whatever reason, they made the choice not to do that and to hand over what, seems to me anyway, to be a really sweet payday to Donald Trump.
Sonja, obviously not because it's so much money and it's kind of pocket change for Disney, but because of the symbolism of it and what it portends, I think.
But this would be, bankruptcy level money for a smaller news outlet too. So it's still setting, or something close to that, a precedent that is dangerous.
Right.
Can you, Sonja, lay out what this lawsuit was about? Because I think to a lot of people, it's hard to understand why this was actually eminently winnable for ABC and Disney and George Stephanopoulos. So could you just sketch out for us what it was that was said on the network and why that is considered a pretty easy case if you're operating in your universe and in Margaret's?
Sure. So this goes back to the case I know your listeners are all very familiar with, the civil case brought by E. Jean Carroll about the sexual assault against her by Donald Trump. And we had a jury verdict there, which found that he had engaged in sexual abuse, sexual misconduct, but the jury did not check the box on the jury form saying that under New York law, he had committed what New York law considers to be rape. Nonetheless, in later legal proceedings in that same case, the judge in that case came out with a ruling saying there is a difference between what New York law calls rape. And I want to speak with care, obviously, for the subject matter here, but it's important for the purposes to be specific here. Under New York law, rape requires being penetrated by a penis. And the judge there found that the evidence suggested, and that it's most compatible with the jury verdict, that they found that he had penetrated her with his fingers rather than with a penis. So while it doesn't qualify as under New York law as rape, The term rape, nonetheless, would apply under a lot of other ways people use that term. He talked about dictionary definitions of rape. He talked about other state laws and what they consider to be rape, things like the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the American Psychological Association, what it considers rape. So what New York law narrowly defines as rape is different, he told us, than how most of us might use that term, even in very specific legal instances. So with that background, in an interview, George Stephanopoulos repeatedly referred to him having been found liable for rape. And this was the challenge about whether that was true or not. The reason this was considered to be eminently winnable by people who follow defamation law is that the First Amendment doesn't require, in fact, very specifically pushes back against requiring literal accuracy in all particulars of the law. Rather, the law only requires that a statement, for it to not be defamatory, that a statement be substantially true. The legal term is literally, is the gist of the statement accurate? And so there's a very solid argument here to say that this was substantially true, that the gist of what the statement was accurate. Just as another example, a lot of laws for a count to be robbery require a use of force, but we all might refer to someone robbing somebody or being robbed when what we really mean is a theft or stealing. And so there's a difference between what sort of a reasonable person would understand by that statement and what the legal definition might be. So they had an argument there. They also had an argument that defamation law requires that you prove reputational damages, which is very hard to do with someone who is as public of a person whose reputation is as solidified. How much difference would there be in the public's view of Donald Trump if they knew he digitally penetrated her versus using his penis? What's the gap there? Is there really $15 million of reputational damage that was there? And then after all that, even if we conclude this was an inaccurate statement and there was reputational damages, they are still protected by the actual malice standards, which have to show that they were reckless in their speaking. And again, being able to point to this judge's decision seems to be a very strong argument to say that they were not acting recklessly in using this word, but they had a reason to think it was an acceptable and accurate word to use.
There's a piece of this where it just feels hinky in much the same way that the Joe and Mika kissing the ring at Mar-a-Lago feels hinky, because now you're not talking about ABC, you're talking about Disney, and you're not talking about something that happens in the open. And it's probably worth saying the depositions were going to happen this week. It's a weird time to cave, right? Right before the depositions, especially if, as Sonja says, it seemed as though they were likely to win. And then the extra hinky thing, which you just flicked at, Margaret, is the flying down to Mar-a-Lago and ABC executives. Sort of all this gets kind of done super quickly, you know, in Donald Trump's home turf. And just this sense that this isn't how we do this. We don't do this by having executives fly around trying to do damage control. Am I overstating that, Sonja? That's part of what I think makes people feel that the ick factor here is higher than it should be?
We have a long-standing tradition of only settling these kinds of cases, we being the press, right? Particularly leading mainstream media like ABC News, to think very carefully about the ramifications of settling a case like this. So that doesn't mean they had an airtight case. It doesn't mean they didn't have valid reasons to consider a settlement sort of in any other situation. But at this moment in time, when Donald Trump has been ramping up what have been his ongoing attacks on the press, on the media, when we have had a number of other issues, they need to take that into context. Everyone needs to take that into context of what kind of message that sends about how they're going to cover the second Trump presidency, about what kind of message they're sending to, as I said, the smaller local regional news outlets who don't have the kind of resources to fight a case like this, whether it's against Donald Trump or a local public official or state official in their neck of the woods when they have a critical piece and they need to think about whether or not they should run it, whether or not they should air it. When they look to a case like this one, I think it sends a very unsettling message about what we expect of the press at this moment, what we want from the press, what their role is, what their job is. And so, right, that doesn't mean this wasn't defensible. That doesn't mean there can't be arguments to be made. It doesn't mean they 100% would have won. But I think at this moment in time, we are all looking to our leaders in legacy media to tell us and show us and give us confidence about how they're going to cover this administration. And this was just a dagger when it came to that sort of feeling that we're all looking for.
The other thing that I think about, and I think is a real shame here, is that I thought that ABC News comported itself relatively well during the campaign. And I'm thinking particularly of the debate that was hosted by David Muir and Lindsay Davis, in which there was live fact-checking. Trump didn't like that. It was a fairly aggressive stance. I thought it was really valuable that they did do it. You know, you might remember that there was the whole they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats thing. And David Muir jumped in and said, you know, we've actually done reporting on that, and that is not something that happened. We talked to the city manager, and Trump, you know, really did not like that. And I think that this reputationally overcomes that good stuff that we saw during the campaign. And I think that's very unfortunate. I'm sure it hurts a lot for the journalists inside ABC News who have seen their network and their parent company kind of roll over here. The other thing I want to mention is that I think the other factor that probably figured into this for ABC News and for Disney was that, as I understand it, this case would have been tried in Florida. And Trump has done a very effective job of getting people to mistrust and hate the press. And so, you know, if you're dealing with a Florida jury and they're predisposed to dislike the press and they're, you know, the state overall voted for Trump. And, you know, it might have been a difficult place to have this play out. And people may have been a lot less interested in the legal precedents and more inclined to say, well, that's terrible that this guy said rape when it wasn't rape. So I'm sure that that entered into it. And here is where Trump's groundwork that he's been laying for many years and even decades, when he said to Leslie Stahl of CBS News, maybe it was in 2015 or so, you know why I do this, right? Meaning disparage the press. And she said, no, no, why? And he said, so that when you write a negative story about me, no one will believe it. You know, he's done this kind of groundwork of getting people, you know, it's the same thing at his rallies, saying it wouldn't bother me if somebody shot these people. So there's been a kind of a teaching and learning of disliking the press. And so I think that's part of the kind of complicated stew that we've got here.
More in a moment with Margaret Sullivan and Sonja West.
Planned Parenthood Federation of America exists so that all people can get access to the sexual and reproductive care and education they need to make informed decisions about their health. More than 2 million patients a year rely on the services Planned Parenthood health centers provide, like STI testing and treatment, birth control, gender-affirming care, abortion, cancer screenings, and so much more. Right now, all across the country, reproductive health care and rights are under attack from public officials who are out of step with the will of the vast majority of Americans. The constitutional right to abortion, control of our bodies, and the health care we need has been stolen from us. And now politicians in 47 states, yes, 47, have introduced bills that would block people from getting the sexual and reproductive care they need. Planned Parenthood knows that equitable access to health care, including safe, legal abortion, is a human right. Right now, Planned Parenthood needs your help to protect access to health care. Donate today by visiting plannedparenthood.org/protect.
After a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. But with Z-Biotics, there's a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. Z-Biotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Also, ZBiotics is continuing to invent probiotics that will help with everyday challenges of modern living. Go to zbiotics.com/amicus to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Amicus at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/amicus and use the code amicus at checkout for 15% off. Back now to our conversation about the emerging legal landscape for the Fourth Estate under Donald Trump. I think both of you are identifying what seems to me like the distillate of the problem, which is the press's role to sort of hold Donald Trump and, to account and to preserve and to protect democracy, which is something you've been writing forever, Margaret, or is the press's role to do some other thing which preserves the sense that the press is fair, even if that's a ridiculous role to ask? Or there's this third role, right? Once you're talking about Disney, which is, enrich your shareholders. And I think that one of the things that is so tricky, both of you made this point, that, a lot of us saw that ABC debate and we're like, good, they're fact checking the, eating the cats, eating the dogs. And I think, as you say, Margaret, Donald Trump has laid the groundwork to have that be disqualifying. That just means ABC is bad. And so it really does lift up this question, how much is it reasonable, Margaret, that your clarion call, which is the press needs to be doing thing number one, which is holding fast to truth, holding fast to the norms of democracy, calling out lies? And how much have we seen that kind of diminished since 2016 when, the Washington Post proclaimed itself, right? Democracy dies in darkness. They were the resistance. And that's gone. And I'm just wondering if this is something of a course correction, because your vision of the role of the press, Margaret, is just not just unfashionable, but it has brought us to this moment where everybody hates the press.
Well, it's not just my vision. I think it's the founder's vision. And I think that it's unique in the Constitution to have a job or a profession called out and protected the way the First Amendment does with the press, with journalists. So we do have a mission in the democracy, and we need to hold firm to it. We may be in a place where vast swaths of the public don't want to do that and don't understand it, don't care, think that we're biased. And, my feeling is we still need to do the job. The answer to that cannot be, okay, well then let's put a lot of election denialists on the air and not ever push back. I mean, we're pointless then. And we are doing that Timothy Snyder thing then of obeying in advance and helping the democracy to backslide. So I think it's really important that news leadership and corporate leadership understand that role. And there's other stuff going on here that's troubling. For example, at the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos's decision at the 11th hour and 50 minutes to pull that Kamala Harris endorsement editorial that had been prepared. And the same kinds of things happening at the Los Angeles Times, actually worse. And this is a kind of about billionaires, and it's kind of about oligarchy, and it's kind of about rich people banding together in league with Donald Trump. So where does that leave journalists? There's only one place it can leave us in the right way, which is doing our job that you just said so eloquently, Dahlia, of seeking the truth, fact-checking, holding powerful people and institutions accountable. If we don't do those things, we've really lost our mission.
I completely agree that the financial element of this is the real part of this story. I mean, it was not all that long ago in the end of the 20th century where Rupert Murdoch referred to owning newspapers as rivers of gold because they were so profitable, which is just laughable to us now. But our First Amendment law, our media law, a lot of how we think about the role of the press versus the government came out of that sort of heyday where the press was powerful in part because it was financially powerful and it was able to stand up to these important public figures, these important public officials. The internet comes along, lotta, and then we have this collapse of the economic model that supports much of the news industry. We have not found a solution to that. One of the little sprouts of hope that came up was we had some of these billionaires come in. Jeff Bezos comes in, buys the Washington Post. So we're all like, hooray, democracy dies in darkness. And then suddenly now we're seeing these signs, we're seeing these tweets of us, celebrating dear leader tweets that come, of course, the canceling of the endorsements. And all of a sudden now we're like, oh no, we have entrusted this important institution to these billionaires. What's going on at the LA Times is very disturbing. So I think that plays in this too. We're looking at Disney and we're saying how much of this is about journalistic values, about playing the role, about really making a sober balancing of First Amendment rights versus, and the public's right to know versus the need to decide when it's important to settle, and how much of this is about the next Pixar film, right? Or how much of this is about Disney World or, other attacks that we have. And so that's very disturbing too, as we're entering what is just clearly going to be an unprecedented level of crony capitalism in this country. To have the leaders of our preeminent media institutions also seem to be factoring this into their decision making. It does go completely against what those of us who care about journalism and care about journalism's role in democracy think is supposed to be the role of the press.
One thing I'd like to add is just that, and you mentioned in your setup, Dahlia, this suit now against the Des Moines Register and against Ann Seltzer, the pollster, who, up until this poll and the way it played out was considered, the gold standard of polling and all this sort of thing. And I think, certainly was well respected and for good reason. Interestingly, the Des Moines Register is owned by Gannett. It's a chain owner of newspapers. And they have had we'll see how it plays out, but they have had a stronger and better reaction to this than ABC News has with all of its resources. And I can tell you for sure that newspaper companies like Gannett have struggled and have done lots of layoffs and have, helped in the whole demise of local journalism. But it is a newspaper company, and they probably have in-house lawyers who they've come along in this path of like, we don't do that. So we'll see what happens. But they said, yes, the poll didn't turn out to be accurate. That's why we've published all of our underlying information, the questions and the methodology and all that sort of thing. And this case is without merit. I wish them well, because I think it's ridiculous to go after a poll that didn't go the way you thought it should go. And there's no suspicion in my mind that Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register somehow were out to get Trump with this poll. It's ridiculous.
Well, and it goes to your fundamental point that you started with, Margaret, which is the point of this is that the bullying feeds on itself, right? So as soon as you have been paid off for being a big honking bully, you just go after anybody who ever hurt your feelings. And this is why it's not just about ABC and George Stephanopoulos. It's an invitation, and Sonja made this point, to go after small papers that don't have the resources that Disney has, and to assume, and I think this is the third level you're both really hinting at, that the larger effect is to chill everyone, right? Who is ever going to want to say or do anything that offends Donald Trump if you're going to bankrupt your paper? Sonja, I want to just ask you to be, you're one of the sort of nation's leading experts on the First Amendment and press freedom. And I would love for you to just do a little bit of Press Freedom 101, because I think that New York Times versus Sullivan is sort of everywhere and nowhere in this conversation. And Donald Trump famously said in 2016 that he wants to, quote, unquote, open up the nation's libel laws to make it easier for public figures to sue the media. This all turns on this 1964 case, New York Times versus Sullivan, that codified media protections that you described at the top of the show. I know Clarence Thomas has said he cannot wait to revisit New York Times versus Sullivan. I also know that one of the things that ABC said when they were explaining to the New York Times why they caved on this case is that they were terrified that this was going to be assaulted at the Supreme Court. Can you just give us the lay of the land on where we're at with New York Times versus Sullivan and how much appetite there really is at the court to revisit it and maybe reverse it?
Sure. And if you'll indulge me for just a moment of flipping into professor mode and just a quick reminder for us all about the history of the New York Times versus Sullivan, because I think it's really important, particularly at this moment in time, that the Sullivan case came to the court, as you said, in 1964. It came out of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And what we saw happening in that case is that we had the media, the nationwide media, begin to sympathetically give news coverage to groups who were challenging the policies of the government, and in particular, covering Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the others who were fighting against segregation and other racist laws and in the South and beyond. So we had these newspapers, we had these television stations who were covering these marches. They were covering the speech. They were covering the police brutality that came in responses to these marches and to these speech. The entire nation was watching. The entire nation was seeing. And so in response to this, what we saw local governments, state governments, local public officials look around for legal weapons that they could use to silence this press coverage that they did not like to silence these voices. And one of the weapons they found was defamation law, which at the time allowed for liability for them to be able to recover damages if there was any kind of inaccuracy in the reporting. And so they exploited the strictness of these laws. They went after news organizations who were trying to cover on this story, even if they just made sort of the smallest and most inconsequential of errors. And so what the court said, what Justice Brennan wrote in that case, is they said, no, this is not how the First Amendment works. It's actually really important that it doesn't work this way at all. But instead, it's really important that we have what he called an uninhibited, robust, and wide open public debate about public officials in particular. And later they expanded this to public figures, that the press needs what he called breathing space to be able to do its work without fear that it was going to face all of these damages. So the court told us that the press isn't going to be perfect. And even if sometimes false things end up making their way into the newspapers, onto TV, it's more important that we protect the right that we have this conversation about our government policies. This is something James Madison referred to as discussing the merits and measures of public men, that it's something that's very important to the survival of our country. So in doing this, they established the actual malice rule, which said that if you're covering a public official or public figure, you're only liable if you knew that what you were saying was not true or if you had reckless disregard for the falsity. But in follow-up cases, the court made it clear what they meant by that like we're talking about serious doubts that what you're publishing is false. It's not just negligence. It's not just that you made a mistake, even a kind of sloppy mistake, but really there were serious red flags about the truth and you went forward anyway. So that is the protection we've had. It is unique in the United States in terms of the ability it gives us to have this robust conversation about people who hold power in our country. It protects everybody, but it particularly protects the work of the press since they're the ones who tend to be doing this. But we have some concerns. And the other interesting thing, too, about Sullivan is that for as long as I was practicing law and teaching constitutional law, this was not something that had any ideological aspect to it. It was something that everyone sort of accepted as part of the constitutional canon. We realized this was something that protects everybody's speech. It doesn't matter sort of what side of the political aisle you are coming on. And that all started to change 5 or so years ago, particularly in 2019. Justice Thomas wrote a separate opinion as part of just a case that the court refused to take, saying, I think maybe we should revisit this. I think maybe this doesn't align with the history and original understanding of the Constitution. And he sort of put this call out there that says maybe Sullivan isn't quite as solid as we thought. Most people that I knew sort of poo-pooed that. They didn't think this was anything to be concerned about, but it only took 2 years before Justice Gorsuch chimed in and also said this is something we need to look at. So if we're trying to count to 5, we've just doubled our votes now from 1 to 2 in terms of justices who are thinking that this is a protection that we need to look at, that and making the argument both that it's not in line with the historical understanding of the role of the press, which is something I would definitely have some disagreements about, but also just that it gives too much protection, they would argue, for the press to be able to say what, in their view, are untrue things about this. There's a lot of people who see things like what's going on with ABC this week as taking us perhaps a step further in that direction or adding to it. I actually think it might be the opposite. They don't need to do the heavy lifting of overruling Sullivan if the press is just going to hand over piles of money and not fight and not rely on it. So I'm not so sure. I also don't think that it's going to be a case brought by Donald Trump that is the one that's going to land at the Supreme Court where they're going to overturn Sullivan. In fact, both of the cases where Justices Thomas and Gorsuch raised their initial issues involved what we call limited purpose public figures, basically people who are mostly private people, except for one particular area where maybe they have some public involvement. I think it's a much sort of weaker area that they have found to start this attack. I think that is where they will look for a case that raises an issue in that arena rather than going all in on a case brought by the most public of public people, Donald Trump. But who knows? You never know at this court what they might do. It's certainly something we're watching. It's certainly something to have some concerns about.
We are going to take a short break.
This episode is brought to you by NRDC. We all know by now that Trump was elected president, and one thing is paramount. We must fight for our planet. The Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, is fighting in and out of court to protect the environment, public health, and climate progress from Trump's Project 2025 agenda. NRDC has done it before, and with your help, they'll do it again. During Trump's first term, NRDC filed over 150 lawsuits against Trump's administration and won almost 90% of resolved cases. And this time, they're ready to fight even harder. Despite Trump and his allies' best efforts to pull society backward again, NRDC will work every day to not let them stand in the way of progress. Your support is critical right now. NRDC is not giving up, and with you, they can safeguard our planet for future generations. Donate now at nrdc.org/podcast. All gifts matched for a limited time.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Let's return now to my conversation with Margaret Sullivan and Sonja West. I'm sure you've never heard the joke, Margaret Sullivan, that I'd love to hear you talk about the overturning of Sullivan, probably the first time it's ever been made in podcast history. But I think I do want to lift up something Sonja just said, which is it is bizarre when you have Disney justifying their decision to take a powder on this one, that what they're really afraid of is this case going to the Supreme Court. So they've done kind of a public service to protect the landmark case. And it feels like it's just another version of the chilling effect, right? That, we're so afraid of the Supreme Court doing a bad thing that we do the wrong thing to protect it. And it feels like the layers of chilling happening without anything changing is one of the things you've been warning us about.
The law becomes unimportant if the press is going to do all the work for the public figure, in this case, Trump. If we're all going to soften our reporting, if the orders are going to come from the top, or even just the hint from the top of, going easy on people. Trump made this statement just maybe 10 days ago when he was giving remarks at the New York Stock Exchange.
The media's tamed down a little bit. They're liking us much better now, I think. If they don't, we'll have to just take them on again, and we don't want to do that.
He was sort of saying, my efforts to soften the edges of press coverage have been successful, and that's a good direction, and they better keep going, because if they don't, there'll be a price to pay. And, you can be sure that that shareholders, that owners, and that other powerful and rich people are hearing that, and they know what that means. And so it's like typical of Trump. He sort of speaks in code, but we all get what it means. And to me, that was just part of the whole, like the last 2 weeks of, yikes, we're going in a really bad direction here. It's actually more than 2 weeks if you count what's happening at the Washington Post and the LA Times and the endorsements and Jeff Bezos deciding to give $1 million to Trump's inaugural fund and, all this stuff. By the way, I should just say, while I was at the Washington Post from 2016 to 2022, so all of Trump's first term, Bezos was a great owner. He stayed away from the editorial product. He did not interfere. And I don't know whether that is going to change in some radical way. I mean, there's some signs that aren't so great, but I'd like to believe that that will continue. And I sure hope so, because along with the New York Times, the Washington Post is extremely important in terms of the kind of reporting they do on presidents and governments.
Yeah, I'll jump in first of all and say everyone should subscribe to the Washington Post. I agree. We have not seen any signs yet of it really crossing into, and we've just continued to see excellent reporting coming out of the Washington Post in terms of Elon Musk and other aspects of this incoming Trump administration. I also add, just to circle back to what Margaret was talking about earlier with Trump's case against the Des Moines Register. We're sitting here talking about defamation. I go into professor mode about defamation, but defamation, just like in the civil rights era where they looked around for a legal tool that they could use against critics of their policies, it's just one tool. And in fact, in these cases, that Des Moines Register case is an election interference case. He has another case against CBS News that's a consumer protection law case, right? This isn't all just about defamation. It's not about, what does actual malice mean? All of these things. They'll find these workarounds. They're going to find these tools. And indeed, they don't have to win a settlement. They don't have to win the case in order to achieve their goals of using these. Usually, in Trump's history, winning isn't the point. He loves to bring these types of lawsuits. And the goal is to bog people down with litigation costs, to use up their time and their resources, to instill fear, and to instill, as we've been talking about, a chilling on their future reporting and coverage of him. That's the win, whether or not he actually gets $1 out of them. So in a case like the ABC settlement, the winning was just icing on the cake, right? It's bringing these cases, it's bogging people down, it's putting the fear into them, and they can use defamation law, but they can use other types of laws as well. And that's what we're seeing from him. He's just looking to see what tools he can pull out of his handbag there to use against the press, and he's using them all.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Sonja, when Trump brought a lawsuit against Tim O'Brien because he didn't like Tim's book. He famously said, quote, "I spent a couple of bucks on legal fees and they spent a whole lot more. I did it to make his life miserable, which I'm happy about." Like, the point is not the win. The point is the grinding. And as you've both said, it's also the chilling. I want to end with this last question, and it dovetails with a conversation I had with Marianne Franks on the show a couple of weeks ago, where she pointed out that First Amendment law, to use your framing from the very beginning, Sonja, is in the upside down now, because the folks who are being protected seem to be, right, Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And now they're saying they're going to go after anybody who says anything bad about Pete Hegseth or Kash Patel, right? First Amendment law is being used to chill criticism of the most powerful, and Marianne would say, bro-y, wealthy men. And it is being used to chill any entity that's supposed to be actually having First Amendment freedoms in order to hold power to account. And I just wonder if either of you has sort of any thoughts about what it is that you would tell an independent journalist who, as Sonja says, doesn't have an army of lawyers, or as Margaret said, doesn't have billions of dollars from a parent company to protect them. What would you say to all those independent journalists out there who are asking themselves the kinds of questions we're asking ourselves on, our editorial Slack this week, which is, oh my God, am I going to bankrupt myself, my family, my company? Like, what are you telling them to do to sort of step up if, in fact, you're both diagnostically correct that the big journalistic institutions may not have their backs?
So I teach at Columbia journalism school, and I deal with a lot of young journalists. And while we haven't actually taken up that precise question, I think I have a sense of where people's heads are. I guess it's easy for me to say this. It's not actually that easy for me to say it. Don't obey in advance. Do your work, do it the right way. And there are legal resources out there for you. There's an organization, and a very good one, called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. That's whole purpose is to defend reporters and journalists, to deal with First Amendment issues. And, that organization has staffed up with a lot more lawyers. It's doing a lot more fundraising. And there are other places that will have your back. And so I would just say, do your work, be careful, do it right, and trust to the extent that it's practical. You're going to be okay. And, I guess we don't really know the answer to that. But if you want to be a journalist, and it's a really important role in our society, then you can't just sort of run for cover here.
I would just add, maybe not a message to journalists, but to everybody else who cares about journalism. It's the end of the year. People think about their charitable giving. So I would echo Margaret's view. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the Freedom of the Press Foundation does important work tracking attacks on the press. And then increasingly we have law schools, including my own, that have legal clinics that are devoted to protecting the First Amendment or to protecting journalists. So we need to, if we want to keep this institution and we want to keep them protected from these attacks, then, we all should do what we can to try to make sure they have the help that they need should it come to this.
Sonja West is the Otis Brumby Distinguished Professor in First Amendment Law from the University of Georgia, who specializes in constitutional law, media law, and the U.S. Supreme Court. Margaret Sullivan is one of my heroes by way of her newsletter, American Crisis. She is a columnist for The Guardian U.S., was the Washington Post media columnist from 2016 to 2022. And before joining the Post, she was the New York Times public editor. And before that, the chief editor of the Buffalo News, her hometown paper, where she started as a summer intern. Oh my goodness, I needed this conversation today like I needed air and water. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for your essential work in each of your lanes. And I am wishing you and your families a very, very happy and meaningful holiday. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Dahlia. It's great to have this conversation.
Yes, thanks, Dahlia, and thanks, Margaret. I'm a big fan.
Thanks. Back at you.
And that is all for this episode of Amicus. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so very much for your letters and your questions and your thoughts. You can keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, or you can find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. I hope you can join us on today's episode of Amicus Plus. Mark Joseph Stern and I are going to dig into some of the big legal news we couldn't get to on the main show. The background on the Planned Parenthood case the Supreme Court has just taken up, and the big First Amendment TikTok ban now set to be argued in the new year. You can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Amicus show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or you can visit slate.com/Amicus Plus to get access wherever you listen. That episode is available for you to listen to right now, and we'll see you there. Sarah Birmingham is Amicus's senior producer. Our producer is Patrick Fort. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio at Slate. Susan Matthews is Slate's executive editor, and Ben Richmond is our senior director of operations. We will be back with another episode of Amicus next week.
When you're part of a military family, you understand sacrifice and support. So at American Public University, we honor your dedication by extending our military tuition savings to your extended family. Parents, spouses, legal partners, siblings, and dependents all qualify for APU's preferred military rate of just $250 per credit hour for undergraduate and master's level programs. American Public University. Value for the whole family. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.
Happy holidays, everyone. Here at Slate, we take karaoke pretty seriously, especially around this time of year. So, for this holiday season, we are bringing that spirit straight to you with a special karaoke-themed episode of What Next Plus. You heard that right. I'm Mary Harris, the host of What Next, and I've teamed up with Anna Sale of Death, Sex, and Money to dive into the joy, chaos, and catharsis of karaoke. You're going to hear Slate staffers and friends share their ultimate go-to songs, from ballads that bring the house down to anthems for this moment we are living through right now. Plus, you'll get a playlist of barn burners and bops to sing along to at home. Head over to the What Next Plus feed and listen now.